Trench warfare is a war tactic or way of fighting that was commonly used on the Eastern Front and the Western Front in World War I. In trench warfare, the two sides fighting each other dig trenches in a battlefield to stop the enemy from advancing. The World War I trenches could stretch many miles and made it almost impossible for one side to advance on the other. The Western Front in World War I was located in France, and that was fought using trench warfare. World War I started on the 28th of June 1914, and by the end of 1914 both sides had built trenches that went from the North Sea and through Belgium and France. Neither side made much ground for nearly 3.5 years, from October 1914 to March of 1918. Here are some facts about World War I trenches that you may not have known. It's estimated that there were about 2,490 kilometres of trench lines dug during World War I. Most trenches were between 1 to 2 metres wide and about 3 metres deep. Life in the trenches was very difficult because they were dirty and flooded in bad weather. Many of the trenches also had pests living in the trenches, including rats, lice and frogs. Rats in particular were a problem, and they ate the soldiers' food as well as the actual soldiers while they slept. Lice also caused a disease called trench fever that made the soldiers itch terribly and caused fever, headache, sore muscles, bones and joints. Many soldiers living in the trenches suffered from a condition called trench foot. Rain and bad weather would flood the trenches, making them boggy, muddy, and could even block weapons and make it hard to move in battle. The sustained exposure to the wet, muddy conditions could cause trench foot, which sometimes would result in the foot being amputated. Cold weather was dangerous too, and soldiers often lost fingers or toes to frostbite. Some soldiers also died from exposure to the cold. Soldiers in World War I rotated through 3 stages of the front line. Most soldiers would spend anywhere from 1 day up to 2 weeks in the trenches at a time. They spent some time in the frontline trenches, time in the support trenches, and also they spent time resting. Even when they weren't fighting, soldiers had work to do, including repairing the trenches, moving supplies, cleaning weapons, undergoing inspections or guard duty. The trenches weren't actually dug in straight lines, but were instead dug in a zigzag pattern. The World War I trenches were built as a system in a zigzag pattern with many different levels along the lines. They had paths dug in them so that soldiers could move between the levels. The trenches typically had an embankment at the top with a barbed wire fence. Often, the trenches in World War I would be reinforced with sandbags and wooden beams. In the trench itself, the bottom was covered with wooden boards called duck boards. These were meant to protect the soldiers' feet from the water in the trenches to try and prevent trench foot. The land between the 2 enemy trench lines was called no man's land. No man's land was sometimes covered with landmines and barbed wire. The distance between enemy trenches was anywhere from 50 to 250 yards apart. The trenches were dug by soldiers, and there were 3 ways to dig them. Sometimes the soldiers would simply dig the trenches straight into the ground, a method known as entrenching. Entrenching was fast, but the soldiers were open to enemy fire while they dug. The second method was to extend a trench on one end. It was called sapping and was a safer method, but it took a lot longer. Tunneling, which was the third method, was a way of digging a tunnel and then removing the roof to make the trench when it was complete. It was the safest method because there was no enemy fire, but it was also the most difficult to do. Sleeping in the trenches was also very difficult. The noise and uncomfortable surroundings made it very difficult for soldiers to sleep in the trenches. They were constantly tired and in danger of falling asleep. This is why the watch shift was kept 2 hours to avoid men falling asleep while on watch. There were several times when ceasefires and truces happened in the trenches during World War I. One example was in 1914, around Christmas time, both the British and German soldiers put down their weapons. They came out of the trenches and exchanged gifts and sung carols to each other, ceasing fire to celebrate Christmas together. Today this is known as the Christmas Truce. If all the trenches built along the Western Front in World War I were laid end to end, it's estimated that they would be about 25,000 miles long. Trenches needed to be repaired constantly to prevent erosion from the weather and from enemy bombs and gunfire. it took 450 men 6 hours to build around 250 metres of British trenches. The majority of raids in World War I happened at night when soldiers would sneak across no man's land, dodging mines to attack the enemies in darkness. Every morning, soldiers would stand to. This is when they stand up and prepare for battle because many attacks would take place first thing in the morning. A typical World War I soldier would have a rifle, a bayonet and a hand grenade with them while fighting in the trenches. We hope you enjoyed these interesting facts about the World War I trenches. If you want more information on World War I, don't forget to check out our World War I video as well as our video on how World War I started.